At the end of Deuteronomy, we read how Moses has died and the leadership of the nation has transferred to Joshua. The nation, they are on the east side of the Jordan River, preparing to cross the river and then on to Jericho. This video will cover the conquest of Canaan as described in the Bible, along with the period immediately following the conquest prior to the establishment of the monarchy. Now, the conquest begins with a long description of the defeat of Jericho and Ai. The biblical text goes into a lot of detail on these battles because they serve as models for how the rest of the conquest was supposed to be carried out. In the Pentateuch, particularly in Deuteronomy, we can find the regulations for how this war of conquest was to be conducted by the people of Israel. Now, there are some details of the conquest that many people have found to be troubling and really in need of closer examination and scrutiny. This video is not going to be addressing those issues, as important as they are. Now, in the fight against Jericho, the destruction of the city is presented in very miraculous terms. The people, they march around the city, blow trumpets, and the walls of the city just crumble before the people. The city is conquered, and not a single Israelite is killed in the process. Now, one significant subplot of the story is the one that concerns the prostitute Rahab and her family. She aligns herself with Israel and helps them to accomplish their task. And for doing this, she is saved along with her whole family. Now, the entire story of Jericho serves as a model for how the rest of the conquest was supposed to be carried out. Israel's victory was not because of their own skill, but it was because of God's miraculous intervention on their behalf. And in the story of Rahab, we see that those Canaanites who would align themselves with Israel, they will be saved from destruction. Now, following the defeat of Jericho, the Israelites then attempt to destroy the city of Ai, but they are unsuccessful in this. And it's eventually discovered that the reason for their failure is because an Israelite named Achan has violated the regulations for war that God gave the people. Namely, he kept some of the plunder for himself. Now, eventually, Achan, we will see that he and his whole family, they are killed, and it is only then that the Israelites can successfully conquer the city of Ai. Now, this whole scenario gives us another example that for the conquest, and that is simply that God takes the regulations of war very, very seriously, and he will not tolerate violating the commandments for how the war of conquest was supposed to be carried out. In Rahab, we see how a non-Israelite can avoid destruction and end up being counted among God's people. In Achan, we see how an Israelite is destroyed and is then counted among the Canaanites. Now, the pace for the rest of the conquest is much quicker. The Israelites effectively just move westward, dividing the land between the north and the south. We then read of a southern campaign and a very brief northern campaign. And it is important to note that the conquest of the land was very much incomplete in the book of Joshua. Many Canaanites were not defeated, and this would become a major issue for the Israelites in the years to come. But again, we have very little detail of the southern and northern campaign that was carried out in the conquest, and we're supposed to understand that it proceeded in a manner similar to what we saw in the stories of the conquest of Jericho and the conquest of Ai, that it was supposed to be miraculous and the people needed to be faithful, and if they were not faithful, God dealt with that sin very seriously, took that very seriously. Now, the book of Joshua concludes with a renewal of the covenant. As we saw before, Joshua connects their story with the covenant that God made with their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God makes that connection. And as the people are preparing to return to their new homes in this newly conquered land, Joshua pushes the people to make a choice. He challenges them to fear the Lord and to serve him with faithfulness. They need to make a decision and choose between the idols that their ancestors worshipped, idols that some of them were perhaps still worshiping, and Yahweh, the God who delivered the people of Israel from Egypt. And Joshua makes a famous declaration. He says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And the people join in with this declaration, saying that they too will serve only Yahweh and obey his voice. Just like we saw Deuteronomy was a renewal of the covenant, Joshua at the end of the conquest is again renewing the covenant with the people. And the book then concludes with the death of Joshua and his burial. Again, very similar to how the book of Deuteronomy ends with the death of Moses and his burial. The next period of Israel's history is known as the time of the Judges. Judges were leaders of Israel, mostly functioning as military leaders. Throughout the book, we see 12 judges, and that number 12 is representing the 12 tribes of Israel. 6 of the judges, highlighted in blue here, are known as major judges, and all that means is just that we have relatively longer descriptions of them and the things that they participated in. The other 6 are just referred to as minor judges. Just all it means is we have a shorter description of them and what they did. And as we read through the rest of the book, there is a pattern that emerges, a behavioral pattern, a literary pattern, that some people refer to as the Deuteronomic cycle. It's fairly easy to spot, even for a casual reader. This is an intentional style of writing that is used throughout the book of Judges, and really through the rest of Israel's history up through 2 Kings. We see this pattern over and over again, but especially in the book of Judges. And it begins with the Israelites. They are faithful, and they're free from their enemies. They're living faithful to the covenant, living under God's blessing and his protection. The people then sin, which causes God to be angry and then punish the people for their sin. And this is all according to what God said how he was going to treat them in the covenant that he made with them at Mount Sinai. In the covenant they entered into, God said this is how he would be dealing with the people. Now, in response to that punishment, the people of Israel then cry out to God, who has compassion on them and raises up a judge to deliver them from their enemies. The people, once again, are faithful to the covenant, and the cycle then repeats over and over again. Now, we read through the stories of the judges, we also see kind of a downward spiral in their character. The first judge was Othniel. He's the first judge, and he's presented in more or less perfect terms. There's not a shadow of any character flaw that we see in Othniel. Don't get a whole lot of description, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with him. He's flawless as he's presented in the book of Judges. I'm going to highlight 2 other judges just to illustrate this progression of moral decline, this regression, I should say. Now, in the middle of the book of Judges, right in the middle, we have the story of Gideon. Now, God does work miraculously through Gideon to accomplish his purposes. We certainly see that. But Gideon also demonstrates some lack of faith. We first encounter him as a man who is very fearful. But probably the most significant sign of this moral decline in Gideon that we see is what happens when the people want him to rule over them, and also for his sons to rule over them after Gideon dies. Now, he responds at first with what appears to be a very pious answer. He says, I can't rule over you because God rules over you. I can't, act as a king over you because God already has that role. Now, that sounds very good, but then right after this, he immediately begins to act in ways that a king would act. So he says the right thing, but he acts like a king. He sets up, first he takes plunder of an amount that really is only fitting for a king. I mean, this is an extravagant amount of plunder. He sets up an idol that the people could worship in his hometown. Now, not only is that an issue for setting up an idol, but effectively what he's doing is he's making his hometown the capital of the city so that people can come to where he's from to worship there. He takes many wives, much like a king would have a harem of wives, and he has 70 sons. That is an extraordinarily high number. That is not a normal size family. And one of those sons he names Abimelech, which in Hebrew means, my father is king. In Samson, when we get further down, he's the last of the judges. His stories of sin are more well known. Samson is made a Nazirite from birth, meaning he has been set apart from the people. Much like the nation of Israel was supposed to be a holy nation, a nation that is set apart from the other nations in the world, Nazirites were supposed to be set apart from the rest of the nation of Israel. Now, normally, vow of a Nazirite was only made for a short period of time. Samson was unique, though, in that he was supposed to be a lifelong Nazirite. This vow was supposed to last his entire life. And in story after story, we see how Samson breaks this Nazirite vow one way after another. And that's just illustrating how bad things have gotten. And the point of Samson's story here is that Israel, again, was supposed to be that nation set apart. Be holy as I am holy. And Samson was like Israel because as a Nazirite, he was supposed to be set apart from the rest of the nation. But as he repeatedly breaks his vow, the time of the Judges shows us a nation that has become more and more corrupt. And the book finally ends with two stories that show just how bad things have become. We won't get into the details of those, but you can read those at the end of the book of Judges. And in the midst of those final chapters, we read this refrain that is repeated several times, just simply, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It's a very dark moment in terms of the moral character of the nation of Israel. There was, however, some glimmers of hope. The book of Ruth begins and is set during this time period, in the time of the Judges. And that's the first verse begins that way, sets us within this time frame of moral decline. And it gives us a story of covenant faithfulness. Ruth, who was from Moab and not an Israelite, shows extraordinary covenant faithfulness to her mother-in-law, and in doing so, she becomes a member of the community of faith. She becomes a part of Israel. Boaz, who shows kindness to Ruth and Naomi, he is a righteous man who is faithful to God's covenant. And through this story, we see how God also continues to be faithful to the Israelites. And it concludes, we see how he protects the lineage of Abraham, eventually leading us to King David. So even though the time of the Judges was a spiritually dark time, there were these glimmers of hope, and we see covenant faithfulness within the nation of Israel.